Hello. See, I'm going to get used to the lights here. Hi. Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor for me to be here after having been in the crowd so many times. It's such a pleasure to get the opportunity to talk, especially after the crazy experience that I've been through the last couple of years. So I'm here today to talk about what I call the view from Washington, D.C. So the last 2 years or so, I was in Washington, D.C., working as senior advisor for digital media at the White House. It's a job I never really thought that I would do. But when somebody said to me, hey, what do you think about working at the White House? I was like, yeah, I'm all in. I've absolutely no idea what I'm in for, but I am totally in. So we packed up, moved to D.C., and I'm not really the kind of guy you would think of when you think of a White House person. I have no politics background or anything. I'm 20 years in the game industry. I feel like I probably know most of you. The game industry seems like a very close-knit family. As I look around, I'm like, oh, hey. So most of you probably know somewhat of what I've been up to, but for those of you who I haven't met, and I hope to meet later, I worked for Nintendo in the early days, N64 days. I'm a software engineer. I ran Game Developer Magazine for a little while. I have a book series called Game Programming Gems that we wound up finally with 9 volumes. And I was briefly at Google, just briefly. But throughout the whole thing, and I've always kind of just thought of myself as a software engineer. So no matter whatever I do at the core, I'm just a coder at heart. So it's always about the tech. So when I tell people I worked at the White House, a lot of people say, was it like the House of Cards? Or maybe, depending on how old you are, was it like the West Wing? Like, So I was part of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, working for the president. And the Office of Science and Technology Policy is around 90 people, brilliant people, passionate people. Everybody's an expert in a particular field. And it's a field that the White House thinks is valuable and may be able to make a difference in the lives of Americans. And so for me to know that was game development was among those categories, that's pretty great. We all worked crazy hours, of course. Not too unlike the game industry, right? It's like we work crazy hours. We're passionate about something, you work crazy hours. You also knew at the White House you were not going to be there for long. It was probably going to be a year or maybe a couple of years. For me, it turned out to be a little over a year and a half. So you work your butt off because you want to make a difference. And of course, you're doing it at a government salary, but hey, that's not why you're there, right? You're there to make a difference. You're not there for salary. So fortunately, it wasn't just me. I wasn't all alone there, jumping up and down and saying, games! Although I did do that. I had a group called the Federal Games Guild, not the actual name of this group. The actual name is, subcommittee of this, interagency of this. We call it the Federal Games Guild because we're games people. It was about 70 people. We would meet once a month. We had a mailing list. These were all people who were at agencies trying to find ways to use games in some way in their work. So you've got, in this picture, you've got Daniel Laughlin from NASA, Ed Metz from the Department of Education, James Collins from Smithsonian, Ruth Anna Gordon from IARPA, and Peg Steffen from NOAA. And you can see somebody photobombing us there. I'm not sure who that is. So it just kind of begs the question, right? So why? Why did the White House say, come here and do game-related stuff? It comes down to this feeling of the promise of games, that games are going to be capable of something amazing. And so I think one example of that we can point to is Fold It. So the game Fold It is a crowdsourced citizen science game. Back in 2011, there was an article in the journal Nature. Was results from this game. The game itself is a protein folding game. This is like 2 clauses you never thought you'd put together, protein folding and game. But the idea is that you're given molecules, you're given protein molecules, you're trying to figure out how these things in real life, how they fold up. And the way that they fold up gives them particular characteristics in life. So it's really important for us to know how these things fold. Unfortunately, it's also really hard to measure how these things fold. You have to use X-ray crystallography. So in 2011, they gave the group of Fold It players a challenge and said, hey, there's this protein molecule. We can't figure out how this thing folds. Maybe you guys can do it. Maybe. And here it is. Try it. And in 3 weeks, the community of thousands and thousands of folded players, they figured it out. They figured out the protein folding for this HIV-related enzyme, kind of important. And that had stumped scientists for 10 years. These guys had figured it out in 3 weeks, a bunch of gamers. So there's the promise of games, right? It's like, oh, maybe this is interesting. It makes you wonder, what else could games do? But it takes a while to figure out how to use these new media types. If you look back, this is an example of a photo from 1857. It's one of the first photos, official government photos. It's of the inauguration in 1857 of James Buchanan. That's on the left. The video is one of the first videos, and that video is from 1897. That's William McKinley's inauguration. If you look back and say, well, how long do you think it took for us to really figure out how to use these media forms for education or for really deliberate purposes? I would say the government, for video in particular, probably took 30 or 40 years. You look at World War II, you can say, well, nailed it. Okay, figured it out. That's a long time. But it does make you look at, okay, government working on games. Okay, we can take some time to figure this out. We don't have to know this right now. We can be a little more at ease with the fact that maybe this is going to take us 10 years or 20 years. So, why else games? Well, of course, games are fun. Why is that important? If you're trying to do something like citizen science that depends on having a lot of people play it, you want the thing they're going to do to be fun, because it's going to attract more people. Pretty straightforward. Games are engaging. People who play a game, they get caught up in it, time passes, sun goes down, sun comes back up, you realize you didn't sleep. Also very valuable if you're doing something that, again, citizen science, I think crowdsourced games are a great example where the more amount of time somebody puts into it, the more research gets conducted, and the more interesting things come out of the other side. So having games be engaging, also really, really interesting. Of course, the president is super interested in games for education. A couple of years ago, he called for investments in education technology, and he said they should be as compelling as the best video game. The US Department of Education said, hey, that's a great idea. Now they're funding a bunch of small business grants for games for education. We'll talk about that a little bit. So 2 games you might have heard of from the government are Budget Hero and Moonbase Alpha. So Budget Hero is, how do you make a budget game fun? Well, Budget Hero, you're trying to balance the budget. This is a game that teaches you how to balance the budget. The way that you play is you're given cards. The cards are policy cards. You can play a few of these cards, and they'll have particular impacts on things. I'm going to raise taxes on sugar. Okay, well, that's going to have this impact on this part of the budget, this impact on this part of the budget. So it's interesting. So you really learn how difficult it is to balance the budget through playing this game. The interesting backside of that is that the designers of the game keep track of all of the policy cards that people play, and then they consolidate that material, and they publish reports out to legislators that say, oh, by the way, 87% of the people who played our games, they instituted a sugar tax. FYI, there might be some interest in the idea of doing a sugar tax, or not. It's a very interesting idea for Budget Hero. NASA's Moonbase Alpha is up on Steam. You can download and play it now. This is a game that's it's a high-fidelity game, PC-based game. The idea is that you're an astronaut, you're on the first colony of Mars, or the moon. Sorry, actually, it started out as Mars. It turned into the moon later. It's not Mars Base Alpha. So you're an astronaut trying to fix the problems that happen in this colony on Mars. Very game-like. It's a 15 or 20-minute experience. It gives you the idea of what it might be like if we were to actually set up a colony on Mars. That's a fun game, and it's been downloaded over 1 million times, which for a government game is amazing. So here's 4 games from government that maybe you haven't heard of. Reach for the Sun is a game, and it occurs to me as I say game from government. None of these are really from government. They're from a game developer funded by the government. So Reach for the Sun is from Filament Games. It was partially funded by a small business grant from the Department of Education. This is a game, also on Steam, that teaches you about plant biology. So in this game, you have to balance the root system that you're creating and the leaf system that you're creating, and when you put out flowers, so that the plant survives, thrives, makes it through the winter, makes seeds, gets you to the next year. So it's a simulation game that teaches you how plants work, and it's fun. Trace Effects is a game from the State Department. And this is a really big game. It's based in Unity. You can go play it on the web right now. It teaches American English language and American English culture. It's designed for people who don't live in America to learn more about America. Unity 3D, and it comes with student manuals and teacher manuals and curriculum materials and DVDs and digital novel. It's amazing. So how many of you have heard of DragonBox Algebra? A few. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So the adaptive version of DragonBox Algebra. DragonBox Algebra is a game that teaches you algebra. DragonBox Adaptive is a version that's adaptive to the player's skill level. So if the player is great, it goes more quickly through the levels. If the player is not so great, it'll generate extra levels to get you moving along. So the adaptive version got some funding from DARPA. And of course, I can't leave off Walden, which is Tracy Fullerton's game from USC. It's based on Thoreau's Walden Pond. It has some funding from the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities. So these are the kind of games we're talking about when we talk about government games. They're games. The second thing people usually say when I say I was working at the White House is they say, oh, violence in video games. And those of us who've been in the industry for a long time have that exact same reaction. Oh, violence in video games. 20 years we've been talking about violence in video games. So I assumed I was going to have to talk about violence in video games. The interesting part was I didn't talk about violence in video games at all. It doesn't seem to be that much of a concern. Or at least it never came up while I was there. It did come up before I was there. I don't know how many of you remember this. So just before I got to the White House, we had a big meeting in DC, and I flew out, and we sat down with the vice president and talked about violent video games in the context of Sandy Hook. I was there. I learned a lot that day. So the fact that I didn't have to talk about violence much was great. So I didn't really have to talk about the negative things. I didn't have to try to convince people. What I got to do instead was I got to focus on fun. I got to talk to people about you can actually learn by playing. It doesn't have to be drudgery. You don't have to be serious. You don't have to be boring in order to have a big impact. You can have fun. And by the way, you should learn to code, because if you learn to code, you're going to have a big impact on the digital world. And that's important. Mindful. Everything we need to do it all has to be evidence-based. When we're talking about having fun, we want to make sure these are things that make sense. We're not just being frivolous. So an example of that, the kind of things that I talked about a lot, is Minecraft EDU. So Minecraft EDU is an education version of Minecraft. Joel Levin, co-founder of Teacher Gaming, created this. And so teachers can go buy Minecraft EDU and use it in their classroom. And they can find curriculum integrated into it and online to teach their kids chemistry, physics. I like the computer science one a lot. I think this is amazing. Minecraft EDU. Minecraft is so huge that finding ways to use it in the classroom it's remarkable. Teacher Gaming also now has a license for using Kerbal Space Program in the classroom. And if you haven't played Kerbal Space Program, you should take out your laptop and download it. Same with Minecraft, for that matter. Kerbal is... How many of you know Kerbal? Thank you. Okay, good. For those of you who don't know Kerbal, lean over to your neighbor, and they'll tell you. It's awesome. It's Lego meets NASA. So we talked a lot. I'm going to show you a few slides from some of the things that we did while we were talking about finding the fun. We always were finding the fun in the context of something. So a lot of what I did was talking about informal science education. So finding ways to teach, finding ways to learn about science and technology and engineering and math, but doing it in an informal way that would get kids engaged. So one of the things we did was the first White House Maker Fair. We invited in all sorts of makers. We invited in a 17-foot-tall electric giraffe, which is what this photo is. And we got kids excited. We had a pancake printer. Crazy, crazy stuff. Really highlighting the capabilities of Americans and moreover, American kids and the amazing things they were doing in science and technology. We also had the White House Science Fair. That's an annual event. And the great thing about the White House Science Fair is that the National STEM Video Game Challenge, the winners of that, they always have a couple of the winners come to the White House Science Fair. So this photo, which I showed you a little bit earlier, I cheated. This is Nicholas Badia. I think he's 15 now. I'm going to get probably an angry email. He might be 16 now. He's amazing. He's made this game called STEMville, which is a game to teach other kids about STEM. And he's like 15 or 16 years old. The president loved it. So it was really great to have him. So every year, ESA and Eline Media and the Joan Gans Cooney Center, they work together on National STEM Video Game Challenge, and we see amazing kids like this come to the White House. Right before I left was Computer Science Education Week, which was something I'm really passionate about as a coder, and wanted to stay through long enough to have an impact on. So right before we left, we had a kids hackathon. We had a day where we had the president coding. I got a picture of that. And we had the kids hackathon. We had 40 kids come in. We had about 40 teachers and parents come in, and we invited a whole bunch of the robot coding people. So we had the Dot and Dash folks. We had some Lego WeDo stuff there. We had Mindstorm stuff there. We had a Now Robot there. We had Coder Dojo there. We had the Google Hour of Code for Christmas lights people there. It was amazing. It was a complete pandemonium at the White House with tons of kids. This is the US CTO and the table that was working on the Sumo robot you can see down in the lower left corner. This is a 3D printed robot that they then program, and it programs over USB, and then the robots fight each other. Crazy. So much fun. And it's all about learning to code. That's the purpose of the whole thing, is to inspire kids to learn to code. So I mentioned that day, we also got the president to code. First time ever. With the help of Code.org, Code.org brought some kids in, and they did the frozen hour of code together, the president. And the president's been a big supporter of the Learn to Code movement. He said that a couple of times now. 2 years in a row during Computer Science Education Week, he's talked about the importance of learning to code. So in this case, he coded in JavaScript. Maybe next year we'll go to Python or C++. C#. All right, so that was my what I did on my Christmas vacation set of photos. Now let me tell you about some of the other amazing things that I got to see. So one of the things that I did during the course of my time at the White House was, for the Federal Games Guild, every week I would do a survey of what was out there, what interesting things I was seeing out in the community that people were doing with games that was games beyond entertainment. They were games that were interesting and fun and something, and encourage you to be fit, and were for citizen science, and whatever. And I would put this little newsletter together, and I'd send it out. And I did that more and more and more. Eventually, I started sending it outside as well, and I hope to continue this now that I've left the White House, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. We called it the Games for Impact Report. It's just a way for the community to be able to get together and learn what each other's doing. Doing that, for me, was a way for me to find out what was actually going on, because I would put feelers out. I would do these newsletters. People would start emailing me and letting me know. So I'm going to tell you about 5 amazing things people are doing with games that you might not know about, that I hope you don't know about, because these are awesome. First game is iWire. So iWire is a citizen science crowdsourced game, so kind of like Fold It, in that it's a massively single-player online game. Tons of people playing, doing the same game mechanics in service of something. In this case, what they're doing is they're tracing out the retina neural tissue, in this case of a mouse. The idea is that the connections between neurons in your brain are something we don't understand at all. And they're really hard for us to trace and figure out what's going on. So what they did is they took a mouse, they took the mouse's retina. This is a really small, simple example of tissue like you'd find in the brain. They cryogenically froze it, they cut it up into cubes, they dyed it, they sliced it, and they scanned it in. And that's what you get in this game, is a cube of mouse retina tissue. And your job is to trace out the neuron. So they usually start you out with a little piece. They're like, this is neuron. They know that. And you can move up and down through the cube, and it knows the connections between the layers. So if you say, well, this on this layer is part of the neuron, it will extrapolate from there. It knows, the connected pieces. So other people have this cube too. When you play the game, you're given a cube. Other people get the same cube. After a certain number of times that cube has been operated on, the back end will take all of that data and say, okay, well, this is what we believe the actual neuron to be. And through this, So here's the exclamation point part. Well, 2,200 players last year, 2,200 players cooperating together, were able to figure out how the retina can identify motion. That's kind of crazy. So 2,200 places. There's an article in Nature, in the journal Nature, in May 2014. And it says the starburst amacrine and bipolar cells, the positions of the cells and the way that they're interconnected, they can tell as something goes across your field of view from left to right, they fire at different points. Your brain interprets that and says that's motion. Awesome. Let's do more of that. So they've had about 160,000 players at last measure. And the more players, the more work gets done. DragonBox Adaptive. Let me tell you about DragonBox. So DragonBox, the algebra game I mentioned earlier. This is the algebra game running in the background. DragonBox Algebra is a commercial game you can buy. It's for mobile devices. There's two versions, one for 5 and up and one for 12 and up. The difference is mostly that one goes faster than the other. The idea is basically that it starts out with pictures of monsters and a box, and you're trying to get the box on one side by itself. And for those of you who know algebra, if you think, well, that's not too different from trying to solve an algebraic equation by getting x on one side by itself, and x equals whatever the other side is. So this starts out with monsters and gives you the same mechanics of balancing an algebra equation, but does it with cute stuff. And then slowly over the course of the game, as it gets harder and harder and harder, cute stuff's replaced by numbers, monsters are replaced with variables, and suddenly you're doing real math. So that's DragonBox Algebra. The adaptive version is the version that DARPA helped fund, which moved more quickly or more slowly depending on the expertise level of the player. So the cool part is the University of Washington Center for Game Science, Zoran Popovich's group, took DragonBox Adaptive. They're the ones who adapted it. And they took it out, and they took it to 4,000 students from K to 12 in Washington State to play this game. And of those students who played 90 minutes, 93% of them were then able to, on a piece of paper, solve 3 algebraic equations. This includes the kindergartners and the first graders, which I'm told the only difference between them and the 11th and 12th graders is that they needed somebody to really focus their attention. They were able to learn it just as well. They learned in algebra. So this is amazing. 93% in 90 minutes, figured out the fundamentals of solving algebra equations. Cool. But can we do better? So they took this, they tried to reproduce it. They did the Norway Algebra Challenge, also in 2013. And the Norway Algebra Challenge, they got the same result, 93%, which is still amazing. 93%. But then they took a pause, they went back, and they analyzed all the data that came out of the back of this thing. Said, well, is there a way that we can improve the adaptive behaviors to be more efficient? Are there some optimizations we made? So then after doing that work, they went and they did the Minnesota Algebra Challenge with students in Minnesota, and now it was up to 95%. So this sweet spot combination of education, games, and big data to find ways to improve education is amazing. This is a really hot and interesting area, and these guys just said, hey, look, we can do it. This is awesome. So the Algebra Challenge as a concept, I think, is going to continue to grow. I noticed, just doing a research for this, that they're looking at doing a France Algebra Challenge, and they're having some discussions with Clinton Global Initiative about maybe doing something even on a larger scale. Game number 3, Project Evo. What's Project Evo? So this in the lower left corner, this is NeuroRacer. This is not Project Evo. I'm going to tell you what the difference is. So there's a neuroscientist at UC San Francisco. His name's Adam Ghazali. And his lab has this amazing equipment, fMRI machines, and the skull cap you see in the upper right. And what they figured out is they can measure cognitive ability. And particularly, one of the things that they've found that they can measure is people's ability to multitask well. And what they've been able to measure, so there was a belief before, which they've able to confirm through measurement, is that people's ability to multitask over time degrades. So when you're 20, you're awesome at it, and you're 80, you're not so awesome at it. Those of us who are between 20 and 80 probably can verify a lot of these assumptions. So he said, well, what if the brain's kind of like a muscle? What if we figured out that we can identify this, right? We figured out that we can measure the level of expertise you have here. Maybe we can make a game that exercises this, and we can see if it improves. So this is what NeuroRacer is. NeuroRacer is the game that they made as an intervention to see if they could find ways to improve people's ability to multitask. That's pretty awesome. So they did a study that 174 participants from 20 to 80, they gave them NeuroRacer. They said, go home, play this an hour a day, 3 times a week, come back in 4 weeks, and we'll measure you again. And when they came back, what they found is that the 70 and 80-year-olds suddenly were as good as, or almost as good as, the 20-year-olds were when they first came in. And not only were they doing that well in the game, they were doing that well in real life. And it had also some knock-on effects in improvements to their working memory and to their sustained attention. They said, well, this is huge, right? This is amazing. We're using a game and we're having real impacts on people in an area that people weren't sure you could have an impact. So this was published in Nature, the journal Nature, September 2013. So this is where Project Evo comes in. There's a group called Achille Interactive that licensed this technology from the lab and is now developing Project Evo. So Evo is the higher fidelity commercial version of this. And they were working with a couple pharmaceutical companies. Pfizer, I think, is doing a study now of 100 people, and they're hoping to get FDA approval to have this game be an intervention you can use to improve your ability to multitask as you age. That's amazing. Game number 4. This is not technically a game. It's a use of a game, but I put it here anyway because it's awesome. And you can also see that I stole this off of YouTube. Sorry. Block by Block is a program. This is a program that's a collaboration between Mojang, makers of Minecraft, and the United Nations Human Settlements Program, also called UN Habitat, because it's easier to remember. And the goal of the program is to upgrade 300 public spaces around the world in the next 4 years. And what they're using Minecraft for is they're modeling the environments, and then they're going to the community and saying, here's your park in Minecraft. Why don't you change your park to be the park that you want? And then give that to me, and we'll consolidate all that, take in all that feedback. We'll all work together, and we'll redesign the park to suit your needs. And then we'll go help you build it. So that's what Block by Block is. You can see in the video, there's examples of what they built as the initial implementations. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a before and after of an area called Lotus Gardens in Mumbai, India. So before is what was there, and then after is what was co-designed with the community. All using Minecraft. Lastly, I'll tell you about number 5, game number 5. So a few months ago, you probably all remember, we were talking about Ebola a lot. And I was wondering, is there something game developers can do to help with the Ebola crisis? And I said that out loud, and somebody told me never to say that again, because the word Ebola and the word game in the same sentence is probably not a good idea. The funny thing was, a couple of days later, I heard about the Ebola Training Challenge. The Ebola Training Challenge is a hackathon with game developers that took place in Seattle. It was run by Shift Labs, Beth Kolko, founder of Shift Labs, a health startup in Seattle. They had heard that they were having a hard time training people who were going to go to Liberia and help at the Ebola centers. These people were going in there, they'd put on their personal protective equipment, they'd overheat, they'd do stupid things because they weren't trained. They're like, can you help us with training? I said, well, sure. We'll see what we can do. So over the course of a weekend, they got 40 game developers together, and they did instead of a competitive hackathon, they did a cooperative hackathon. So they said, well, let's try and make a simulation. We'll do it in Unity, because we're game developers, we know Unity. We'll use a Kinect, and the Kinect will monitor what the person is doing, so if they do something dumb, like putting up their hands and scratching their nose with their Ebola-covered glove, we'll tell them not to do that. So they created this simulation. You can see it's simulating the humidity on their goggles, because after about 45 minutes in one of those suits, your goggles, they fog up. And you got to take your suit off, or you're going to reach up with your glove, which is something you don't want to do. So this is amazing. Again, an example of games, or game technologies in this case. There's no leveling up in the Ebola Training Challenge. Being used for something more. Oh, I think I got an advance there and a no advance there. Let's see. Could you back me up on the notes? Thank you. So, 5 very different games, very different uses of games, game technologies. What does that have to do with us? I mean, we all focus on entertainment. In fact, we're really good at focusing on entertainment. I mean, look at these graphs. They all go up and to the right, exactly what you want graphs to look like. We've been doing amazing, like for years and years and years now. You know, there's some bumps in the road, there's some shrinkage here, and there's some expansion here, but for the most part, we figured out how to do games for entertainment really, really well. And that's awesome. But there's a little caveat here, like the mainstream games, the number of genres we're exploring is kind of shrinking down. The kids and licensed stuff all left, went over to mobile. And, we keep focusing on entertainment over and over and over and over. You just gotta wonder, isn't there more? Is there more that we could do? Aren't games as an art form, shouldn't we explore more? The world's a huge place. And you can say, well, indie game developers, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, look at these indie games. This is a Google search result. Like, this is 20 games that all look different and amazing and crazy and awesome. And yes, there is so much variety in the ecosystem of games for entertainment, and I love it. But I think even in mobile, there's starting to be some challenges where team sizes are getting bigger because production quality is going up. It's harder to do user acquisition. It just costs more. It's getting tougher and tougher as an indie game developer, too. Also, you've got kind of the Candy Crush phenomenon where you make a great game, or maybe this is a Flappy Bird phenomenon. You make a great game, and then now there's 20 games that look just like yours. Actually, this is the 2048 phenomenon. I'm renaming it. What a bummer. I made a great game. It was totally outside of the box, new genre, and now everybody copied me. Okay. Well, it made me wonder, are there other things game developers could focus on too? And I love games for entertainment. Don't get me wrong. I love games for entertainment. But I wondered, what if we could get all these amazing game developers in the community to come and try something different just for a weekend? And I thought, I know the right place to do that. That's the White House. So we said, let's do it. We called up a bunch of game developers, got 100 game developers to fly into town into Washington, D.C., 35 educators and researchers and students, and we all hung out for the weekend and made games together, games for education. And each game team was partnered up with a teacher, and the teacher was matching things up with standards. And at the end of the weekend, we had a celebration at the White House, and we showed off what we made. We'd made 23 amazing education games. I think we did pretty well. Pardon the low-tech way I'm playing all these videos here. This is just a selection of 12 of the 23. The thing that made me feel so good about this experience is the developers who had so much fun over the weekend. And the jam itself was a blast. And I had people come up to me afterwards and say, I'd never thought about doing this before. Like, I'm going to rededicate myself, try to find ways to do some education games. I had a studio come to me and say, can you help me find funding? What are the ways that I can find to spend more time looking at games for education? It really showed the potential. The educators who were there all left super energized and trying to figure out how to work with game developers more. So this work, this game jam, to call it work is laugh because it was so much fun. It's going to go on. So I think that the U.S. Department of Education, who was our partner for executing this, is going to try and do another education game jam in Austin. If you're in Austin, coming soon. And there's a conversation about trying to use climate change data and also do some kind of game jam. That's a kind of interesting thing to think about, like a very specific, focused thing. What if you had all of the data and you were trying to find ways to share it with people? Not in a pedantic or political way, but here's the data. Why don't you make your own judgments based on the data of what you think is going on in the climate? Like, what would you make? And how would you make it fun? It's interesting. So if you go to the link at the bottom of this page, you'll find all of the White House education game jam videos. So I think we've been great at making entertainment games. I'm always cautious about talking about other kind of games because I don't want people to think, I hate entertainment games. I've done it for 20 years. But can't games do more? Like, there have never been this many game developers before, right? We have 400 schools in North America training game developers. It's amazing. It's never been this easy to create games. It's never been this easy to distribute games. Isn't now the time we should be exploring other opportunities? Why are we not exploring all that games might be capable of? Let's work together and figure out how we can redefine what it means to play a game. I think there are 3 great examples of people who are trying to do this that you may have heard of. The Global Game Jam, which was pretty recent, 28,000 people around the globe making games over a weekend. Jamming is an amazing way to explore a different space. Amnesia Fortnite, Double Fine's Amnesia Fortnite. This is a 14-day-long game jam, essentially, where they're exploring new ideas for games. And then Glass Lab is an educational lab based at Electronic Arts. It's a collaboration with EA and SRI and ETS and the Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. They're trying to find ways to really make big budget, AAA quality education games. These are all super interesting ideas for ways that we could think about to explore the areas we're interested to have games go. So again, I just want to say thank you so much for having me be here, and it's been my honor to try to tell everybody how amazing games are from the White House for the past few years. And I'm going to continue doing that in whatever way I can do it. But I love doing it at the White House. And if you want to stay in touch on other places games are going, games for education, games for health and fitness, games that teach computer science, if you're curious about this topic, I'm going to stand up a group, and we'll call it the Games for Impact Report for now. And this is the bit.ly link. You can go there and throw your email in there, and we'll all find a way to communicate together. There's a great IGDA group as well that covers educational games. You should be sure to reach out and engage with that. There are 3 awesome conferences: the Games for Change Conference in New York City, Games Learning and Society, which is based in Madison, Wisconsin, and Serious Play, which moves around, but this year is at Carnegie Mellon. These are all amazing resources. The talks that are online, the papers are online. Check those out. And lastly, just thank you to all of the fantastic partners that I was able to work with. There's no way I could have done this by myself over the last 18, 20 months. That was a crazy cauldron. And having ESA and having IGA and Learning Games Network, Foundations, Joan Gans Cooney Center at the Sesame Street, Eline Media, the guys who make Never Alone. These folks were all fantastic partners for me, and I just want to say thank you to them. And thank you to you for doing everything that you do. And I will look forward to playing your games more in the future. Thanks.